What if I told you the US government spent decades funding people who claim they could see across the world without leaving a chair? Not with satellites, not with drones, not with technology, with their minds. This wasn't a rumor, it wasn't a fringe experiment. It was funded, classified, and quietly continued for years. They called it remote viewing. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The government didn't ask if it was real, they asked how it could be used. To understand remote viewing, you have to understand the Cold War. This wasn't just a standoff of weapons, it was a war of information. Who knew what first? Who could see farther? Who could predict the next move? During this time, intelligence agencies were obsessed with one thing: surprise. Missile silos, submarine positions, hidden facilities. If you could see something before your enemy did, you didn't just win battles, you prevented them. And that fear cuts both ways, because in the 1970s, US intelligence began receiving reports that the Soviet Union was investing heavily in psychic research, telepathy, psychokinesis, and something called remote viewing. Whether those reports were exaggerated or not almost doesn't matter, because intelligence agencies don't wait for proof, they wait for risk. And the risk was simple: what if this works and we ignore it? Remote viewing wasn't presented to the government as magic. That's important. It wasn't framed as supernatural. It wasn't sold as intuition or psychic ability. It was framed as a human perception problem. The core claim of remote viewing was simple and deeply unsettling: that the human mind may be able to access information without knowing how it accessed it. Not through sight, not through sound, not through touch, but through something else. Something undefined. Remote viewing wasn't about seeing distant locations, it was about perceiving data without context. That distinction mattered to the researchers because context introduces bias. If you tell someone they're looking for a military base, they'll imagine one. So viewers weren't told what they were targeting, they weren't given maps, they weren't even given coordinates that meant anything. Sometimes they were given nothing at all, just a designation, a number, a placeholder, then asked to describe what came up. Not conclusions, not stories, just raw impressions. Shapes, textures, movement, density, temperature. The belief was that meaning comes later, if at all, that the signal arrives before understanding. This is where remote viewing starts to feel less like mysticism and more like a challenge to how we think consciousness works. Because humans already do this, just not deliberately. We sense when we're being watched. We feel unease without knowing why. We know something is wrong before we can explain it. We make decisions based on gut instinct, then justify them afterwards. Remote viewing asked a dangerous question. What if that instinct isn't noise? What if it's unlabeled information? The researchers involved didn't claim the mind was omniscient. They didn't claim accuracy. They proposed something far more modest and more disturbing: that consciousness might not be local. That perception might not require proximity, that information might not always move in straight lines, and that the brain might act less like a generator and more like a receiver. That idea alone was enough to justify attention, because if even a fraction of that were true, then the limits of intelligence gathering change, and so do the limits of being human. This is why agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense didn't dismiss the idea outright, not because they believed in it, but because they couldn't disprove it cleanly. Remote viewing didn't produce clear failure, it produced ambiguous success. Signals buried in noise, patterns that emerged only after the fact, which is the most uncomfortable kind of data there is, because it forces a choice. Either the results are coincidence, or there's something about human awareness we don't understand yet. And intelligence agencies are trained never to assume coincidence when the stakes are high. Remote viewing wasn't an attempt to turn people into weapons, it was an attempt to answer a quieter, more dangerous question. Is the human mind more capable than our models allow? And if it is, what else have we been leaving on the table? Once the US government decided remote viewing was worth examining, the question became simple. Not, is it real, but how would you even test something like this? That responsibility fell to researchers at the Stanford Research Institute, specifically scientists like Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. And this is where the story changes, because Puthoff and Targ weren't mystics, they were physicists. They approached remote viewing the same way they would approach any anomaly, by trying to remove every normal explanation first. The early experiments weren't dramatic. They were boring by design, and that's what made them dangerous. In some tests, a target would be randomly selected and placed inside a secure location. A locked room, a sealed envelope, sometimes a safe miles away from the viewer. The viewer would have no access. No clues, no timing cues, no feedback. They would be asked to sit quietly and describe anything that came to mind. Not guesses, not conclusions, just impressions. In other tests, the target wasn't an object at all. It was a location. Someone would travel to a randomly selected site somewhere in the country, chosen only after the viewer session had already begun. The viewer, with no knowledge of where the person went, would attempt to describe what the person was seeing. Landforms, structures, textures, movement. Again, not names, not labels, just features. Afterward, independent judges would compare the viewer's descriptions against multiple possible targets. The question wasn't, did they get it right? It was, did their description match the correct target better than chance? And this is where things became uncomfortable, because in some cases, they did. Not perfectly, not consistently, but often enough that the data refused to behave. Puthoff and Targ weren't claiming psychic success, they were reporting statistical anomalies, patterns that shouldn't exist if nothing was happening, and that's the worst possible outcome in science. Not proof, but noise that doesn't disappear. So they tightened controls, they increased distance, they reduced information, they isolated variables, they actively tried to break the effect. And it still appeared, sometimes, which forced a very narrow conclusion. Either the human mind could access information in a way we don't understand, or coincidence was behaving with unusual persistence. And coincidence isn't something physicists are trained to trust. One of the most unsettling aspects of these tests was how inconsistent the results were. The same viewer could succeed one day and fail the next. Accuracy seemed affected by mood, fatigue, stress, expectation, which made the phenomenon impossible to weaponize, but very difficult to dismiss, because randomness doesn't usually care about psychology, so whatever was happening was tied to the human mind itself. Not a signal, not a device, not a process that could be automated, and that created a dilemma, because intelligence agencies don't need perfection, they need edges, and remote viewing, even at its weakest, occasionally provided one. It didn't give answers, it gave questions. It pointed analysts towards places they hadn't considered, assumptions they hadn't challenged, possibilities they hadn't modeled, which meant remote viewing wasn't valuable because it replaced intelligence, it was valuable because it exposed blind spots, and that made it impossible to ignore. Over time, remote viewing moved out of the laboratory and into application. What began as research questions slowly became something else. The program changed names repeatedly: Grill Flame, Sunstreak, Center Lane, Stargate, different budgets, different oversight, different justifications, but the core question never changed. Could this be used operationally? Remote viewers were asked to attempt tasks no conventional system could handle cleanly: to locate hostages, to describe facilities no satellite had seen, to identify weapon sites hidden from reconnaissance, to track aircraft that had simply vanished, and sometimes they produced information that unsettled the people reviewing it. Not consistently, not reliably, but often enough that the work continued. And here's the detail that matters most. Remote viewing was never treated as a replacement for intelligence. It was treated as a supplement, an edge, a last resort, something you only ignore if you're certain it doesn't work. And the problem was, they were never certain, which is why the program didn't end quickly, and why it would eventually hinge on the experiences of individual viewers, not the system itself. When people imagine government psychic programs, they usually picture eccentrics, outliers, mystics, people on the fringe of society. That stereotype collapses when you look at Joe McMoneagle. McMoneagle wasn't a mystic, he wasn't a showman, he was a decorated US Army intelligence officer, a career military man. analytical, structured, skeptical by nature. And during the Cold War, he would become known as remote viewer number one. Not because he was the first person to attempt remote viewing, but because he was the first to be formally assigned, documented, and evaluated inside the program. McMoneagle participated in hundreds of remote viewing sessions. His task wasn't to predict the future, it wasn't to impress anyone, it was to describe targets he had no access to. No photographs, no satellite imagery, no briefings, sometimes not even a geographic reference, just coordinates or nothing at all. He was instructed to report impressions only, not interpretations. Again, textures, shape, movement, scale. And that distinction mattered because the program didn't reward imagination, it punished it. McMoneagle himself remained openly uncomfortable with the process. He didn't describe it as seeing, he described it as information arriving without context, fragments that didn't feel owned, which created a problem. Because the more accurate some sessions appeared, the less control he felt he had over where the information came from. And one session in particular would follow him and the program for decades. McMoneagle was given a set of coordinates. No explanation, no indication of what he was supposed to find. As he began describing the target, he reported something that immediately confused the analyst reviewing the session. He described a large, metallic, industrial structure, enormous in scale, complex, engineered, and unmistakably similar to a submarine. But there was a contradiction. According to McMoneagle's impressions, this object was not in the ocean, it was inland, surrounded by land, housed within what felt like a massive industrial facility. To the analyst, this sounded like an error, a misinterpretation. Obviously, submarines don't exist inland, at least not according to the intelligence available at the time. The session was filed, largely set aside, and then later, satellite reconnaissance revealed something unexpected. The Soviet Union was constructing nuclear submarines at inland facilities using internal waterways and canals to transport them before final deployment. The existence of large-scale submarine construction away from the coast was not widely known at the time of McMoneagle's session. His description didn't provide dimensions, it didn't name the location, it didn't replace traditional intelligence. What it did was challenge an assumption. And intelligence work, that matters more than precision, because intelligence failures don't usually happen because of missing data, they happen because something is assumed to be impossible. And remote viewing occasionally did something unsettling. It revealed blind spots. Not answers, not certainty, just places where the map was incomplete. McMoneagle never claimed psychic mastery. He downplayed the significance of individual sessions, and at one point, after being asked to describe a target that appeared to exist in the future, he refused to continue similar tasks. Not because the session failed, but because it raised questions he didn't want answered. Later, McMoneagle would be awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the highest non-combat decorations in the US military. That detail is very easy to overlook, but it matters. The military does not award honors at that level for pseudoscience. They award them for service they believe produced value, which leaves us with an uncomfortable reality. Even if remote viewing was inconsistent, even if it worked only occasionally, the US government believed McMoneagle's contributions mattered enough to formally recognize. And that brings us back to the core discomfort of the program. They didn't need certainty, they needed possibility. Because in intelligence work, something that works sometimes is something you can't afford to ignore. There is one session involving Joe McMoneagle that almost never gets discussed seriously, because it sounds ridiculous. And because of that, it's usually dismissed outright. McMoneagle was once given a target with almost no context, just coordinates and a single instruction. He was told to describe what existed there 1 million years ago. Only afterward was he told the location. Mars. What followed wasn't a technical description. There were no machines, no cities, no science fiction imagery. What McMoneagle described instead were impressions of vast, empty landscapes, large structures, a sense of collapse, and beings that felt ancient, weakened, and near extinction. Now, let's be very clear. This does not mean Mars once hosted intelligent life. There's no physical evidence to support that. That is not the takeaway here. The reason this session matters has nothing to do with Mars. It has to do with the methodology, because this was never intended to be a factual mission. It was a boundary test, an attempt to see what would happen if the method was pushed beyond space and beyond time. And the result was unsettling in a different way. McMonagle later described the session as deeply uncomfortable, not because of what he saw, but because of the implication that the process did not seem to care whether the target was real or hypothetical or temporarily impossible. It simply produced imagery. And that raised a disturbing question for the researchers. If remote viewing could generate internally consistent experiences, even when untethered from reality, how do you tell signal from imagination? Where does perception end and narrative begin? That session didn't prove remote viewing could access the past, but it did reveal something else, that the method itself had no natural stopping point, and that made it dangerous, not as intelligence, but as psychology. After decades of funding, research, and classified use, the remote viewing program was officially shut down. The explanation was simple, too simple. According to the final reports, remote viewing just wasn't reliable enough. Results were inconsistent, accuracy varied, operational value couldn't be guaranteed. On paper, that sounds reasonable. But here's the problem. Intelligence agencies don't shut programs down because they work sometimes. They shut them down when they don't work at all. And remote viewing didn't fail cleanly. It produced something far more uncomfortable. Occasional success, unpredictable accuracy, results that appeared after the fact or before confirmation existed. It's not useless, that's dangerous, because intelligence systems are built on repeatability. You can't base decisions on something that works one day and vanishes the next. You can't schedule it, you can't standardize it, you can't guarantee it, and most importantly, you can't control it. Remote viewing depended entirely on human consciousness. Fragile, variable, emotionally influenced, psychologically vulnerable. Two viewers could be given the same target and experience completely different impressions. Even the same viewer could produce different results on different days. That alone made it incompatible with military planning. But that's not the real reason it was shut down. The deeper problem was this. Remote viewing didn't just produce information, it produced questions. Questions no one could answer. Questions like, where did this information come from? Why did it arrive incomplete? Why did it sometimes appear before conventional intelligence? Why did it occasionally contradict known data and later turn out to be right? Remote viewing challenged a core assumption intelligence depends on, that information flows forward, that perception requires proximity, that knowledge has a clear source, and that made it fundamentally destabilizing. Because if even a small part of consciousness could reach beyond the body, even briefly, even unreliably, then the entire framework of observation breaks down. And intelligence agencies don't like frameworks they can't define. They don't like tools they can't replicate, and they don't like questions that blur the line between psychology and reality. So the program was closed, at least officially. Files were declassified, reports were summarized, the conclusion was softened. Not useful enough, not operational, not reliable. But notice what they didn't say. They didn't say it never worked. They didn't say the results were meaningless. They didn't say it was impossible. They said it was impractical. And that distinction matters because something doesn't have to be practical to be real. And it doesn't have to be reliable to be dangerous. Remote viewing wasn't shut down because it threatened national security. It was shut down because it threatened certainty. It forced analysts to consider the possibility that information could appear without a sensor, without a satellite, without a wire. And if that door stays open, even a crack, then the scariest question isn't whether remote viewing could be weaponized, it's what else might be possible that we haven't already decided doesn't fit. By the time the program ended, the question had already been answered. Not publicly, not conclusively, but internally. There was something here. Something that refused to behave like a coincidence, something that couldn't be controlled, but couldn't be ignored either. And that's what makes remote viewing linger. Not as proof, not as belief, but as a possibility that never fully closed. Because the official conclusion didn't say it was impossible, it said it was impractical, which is a very different thing. Impractical doesn't mean false, it doesn't mean imaginary, it just means inconvenient for a system built on predictability. And that leaves us with the part no report can resolve. If human perception can occasionally reach beyond what we understand, even once, even briefly, then the limits we rely on aren't actually limits, they're assumptions. And assumptions have a way of collapsing quietly, long before anyone notices. And here's the part that never made it into the official conclusion. Remote viewing was never disproven. It was simply set aside, not because it answered too little, but because it asked too much. Thank you for watching another deep dive from around the way. Like, comment, subscribe. Let us know what crazy topic you want us to cover next. Have a good one.